G'day, it's the Thomas of post-production here. I have recently been made aware of a bit of a fumble that I've made in some of my pronunciation, and unfortunately I didn't realise this until after I had recorded basically every single episode. The fumble in question is in the pronunciation of Abel Tasman's name. It is in fact in the original Dutch not pronounced Abel, it's Abel Tasman. I do apologise for not getting that correct. Genuinely don't know how that managed to slip through. I guess it's just one that I didn't really check. So I do apologise for that. That's a whoopsie. That's on me. As I said, I didn't realise this until after I had recorded pretty much every single episode. So for the next few episodes, I have continued to use the Abel pronunciation just for consistency. But do remember that it is not pronounced Abel, it is pronounced Abel. Sorry again. Kia ora, g'day and welcome to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Episode 134. I am the one who knocks. This podcast is recorded in Te Whanganui Atara, the rohe of Muupoko, Taranaki Whānui, Te Atiawa and Ngāti Toa Rangatira. We are generously supported by our amazing patrons, such as Noel. If you'd like to support Hans, go to patreon.com/historyaotearoa. Last time, Abel Tasman arrived in the land of the long white cloud, sailing up the western coast of Te Waipounamu and coming to anchor in Mohua Golden Bay near modern Tākaka. However, he and his crew weren't alone. They were being watched by the indomitable Pa of Taupo Point, and the Māori inside wanted a closer look. Later in the afternoon on the 18th of December, the same day Tasman had arrived in the bay, the people watching from the shore would have seen two smaller boats emerge from the larger ones, heading towards Taupo Point, seemingly with purpose. Both boats were being rowed in a manner much different than what the Māori were used to, and occasionally they stopped rowing to toss ropes overboard. But they never came all the way to the beach. On board the two small vessels were a visher and ghilliesmans, along with a bunch of sailors, who were sent in the cockboats to scout out some possible harbours for the larger ships to anchor in, which would give them some shelter from the winds coming in from the open sea. From the ropes, they measured 13 fathoms depth in the water, which was definitely enough for the main ships. By the time they had finished, the sun had dipped behind the hills, and it was rapidly getting darker, so they decided to head back. This whole time, the two main vessels had been slowly drifting southwards, because they hadn't actually been anchored. They just had their sails furled, meaning the wind wasn't pushing them, but they were still at the whims of the ocean currents and tides. When the two smaller boats returned, Tasman and his council took the findings and decided to set anchor where they were for the night, leaving any plans for a landing party for the next day. Although they were done with the whenua for the time being, the whenua wasn't done with them. From the ship's journal, quote, "In the evening, about 1 hour after sunset, saw many lights on the land, and 4 vessels near the shore, 2 of which betook themselves towards us." End quote. Since we have no contemporary sources from Ngāti Tūmatakōkiri, we don't know exactly what was going on, but we can make an educated guess. It seems that taua were hastily being formed on the beach to launch waka, loading toa and at least 1 or 2 rangatira into the vessels, with the intention of getting the measure of these newcomers, these foreigners, translated into te reo Māori as Pākehā. Although the newcomers hadn't been obviously aggressive, they also hadn't come to declare their intention, as was the Māori custom, which maybe made the rangatira anxious, possibly considering whether they wanted to call upon allies from nearby Pa. This particular evening was clear and still. So it's possible that the rangatira realised that with no wind, if the sailors on the larger ships became hostile, their ability to pursue was limited, which may have given them the confidence to get closer. However, again, we don't know either way. Rapidly, the assembled crews launched 4 waka, 2 heading directly towards the Dutch ships. The men on the waka were silent as they approached, save only the sound of their paddles in the water. Once they were within earshot, what we assume was one of the rangatira shouted up the sides of the much larger vessels. From Tasman's journal, quote, "Those from the 2 canoes begin to call out to us in gruff, hollow voice, but we could not in the least understand any of it. They blow also many times on an instrument which gave sound like the Moors' trumpets, but did not come nearer than a stone piece's shot. We had one of our sailors, who could play somewhat on the trumpet, blow back to them in answer. Those on the Zeihan had their undermate do likewise." End quote. The instrument like a Moor's trumpet that they mention is probably a putatara, a large sea snail shell attached to a wooden mouthpiece that is blown into, or a pukaya, a longer trumpet made of wood. Blowing these instruments was potentially meant by the Māori as a challenge for the strangers to declare their intentions, or could have been to, quote, assert their identity and mana, and raise their own morale by challenging the visitors to fight. End quote. This was standard in Māori society, and it was common to try take the initiative during interactions that may become hostile. We've seen this before in other circumstances where Māori would try to show their physical and battle prowess to deter aggression from the other side. If the opposing side was Māori, they would have understood what was happening and likely responded in kind. However, they weren't, so Tasman and his men didn't react in a way that was expected. The stone pieces shot is referring to the range of their cannons. So, to the Dutch, it looked like the Māori were staying a sensible distance from the ships to avoid being fired upon. However, I find it extremely unlikely that Māori were doing this exactly. They possibly were keeping their distance as a precaution, but not with the specific intent of avoiding a weapon they had never seen before. Obviously, neither side knew what the other was saying. In the next day's entry, Tasman makes specific reference to the fact that the language the Māori were speaking didn't match the words they had been given to communicate with the people of the Solomon Islands. Now that both sides got to have a good look at each other, it is possible that the Māori thought that the people on board these strange ships were spirits of some kind. The strangeness of the design of the ships, perhaps accentuated by the fact that the ship would have been dimly lit with lanterns, the high sides making it hard to see those on board and what they were doing. Adding to this was the strange tongue they spoke and their pale skin, both of these being common traits of Patupaerehe. Shouting at them, telling them to go away, and playing a loud putatara were the usual ways to dispel spirits. So there is a chance that's what they were doing. However, it seems that the trumpeted reply from the Dutch confused the Māori, because they fell silent as soon as they heard it, prompting the second waka, which had been hanging back observing this interaction, to paddle to the shore to report on what had happened. The waka that had been shouting at them followed soon after, as the darkness began to close in. thus bringing to a close the very first interaction between Europeans and Māori. Now, this definitely wasn't the worst outcome of first contact between two cultures, but it wasn't exactly the best either. Tasman was sufficiently wary of this interaction, not sure what may happen under the cover of night. So he told his men to double the normal watch. It was fairly typical when at sea for men to wander the decks and keep an eye out for danger, or keep watch. What was less typical was that Tasman also ordered they prepare swords, pikes and muskets, along with the shot and powder to use them, so that they could be easily available should the need arise. As a further precaution, he ordered the cannons cleaned and be prepared for use. Tasman was taking no chances. Of course, we don't know what Ngāti Tūmatakōkiri did that night, or how those who remained on shore reacted to the tale relayed to them from the Waka crew. Māori were well aware that there were lands beyond Aotearoa. Their stories told that they themselves came from elsewhere. So was there a few, perhaps less superstitious people among them that proposed that these weren't spirits, but tangata from a different whenua that travelled here from afar. Who knows, but it is certainly plausible that they would come to that conclusion. There is also the thought that the reaction by Māori could have been driven by the fact that part of the bay was currently under rāhui, a sort of spiritual ban, or some other tapu, and that Tasman had unknowingly sailed into waters he shouldn't have been in under Māori tikanga. Later we will see European explorers being attacked for very similar offences, so this hypothesis is also very plausible. We can only assume that night the rangatira gathered in a whare, taking reports from their toa, listening to them intently as the glow of the fire flickered across their faces, before discussing what they wanted to do when Tamanui Te Rā showed his face in the morning. They were likely just as concerned about being attacked as Tasman was, so sentries were likely stationed on the walls to alert the pā should anyone try to surprise them in the darkness. And I wouldn't be all that surprised if the mood within each whānau was tense, unsure of what tomorrow might bring. What probably added fuel to this apprehension, and perhaps any arguments being made for a more aggressive response, was that this was occurring during summer, the season where Māori typically marched to war. Two big, strange ships turning up in the middle of summer and not declaring their intentions was pretty fucking suspicious. Should the situation come down to a fight, although the Māori were very definitely outgunned, though they probably didn't know it, they actually had a lot of advantages. Their waka were a lot more agile in the water than the much larger flout and yacht. The Māori crews were all skilled soldiers and sailors, whereas the Dutch soldiers were not experienced seamen and had little experience in ship-to-ship warfare. Remember, they were on board to deter mutiny from their own crew, not fight an outside enemy. In terms of just straight numbers, the Māori had approximately 100 capable toa, to the Dutch's 36 soldiers and 73 sailors, the latter of whom definitely weren't used to combat. Again, it was summer, so the Māori had lots of food and were likely geared up for a fight anyway. Assuming the Dutch didn't try to land a force on the beach, which was unlikely since it would have made the Dutch easy pickings if they didn't defeat the Māori first, then the Māori could also dictate when the battle occurred and in what manner. Of course, Ngāti Tūmatakōkiri were on home turf, so they knew the sea of their region much better than the Dutch, being able to take advantage of reefs or sandbars. But it's also worth noting the home field advantage in a psychological sense. The desire to ensure the safety of friends and family can be a major motivator. Their stake in the fight, real or perceived, was much higher than the Dutch, and that can give them the drive to win the day by sheer will alone. On the flip side, the Dutch were experienced in naval warfare generally as a nation, having won many battles against the Portuguese and Spanish. Tasman, Ghilliesmans, and likely other officers also had personal experience fighting naval battles, but that was against ships and weapons similar to their own. The rangatira would fight very differently than the Dutch were used to. Of course, the main advantage the Dutch had was their ranged weapons, which Māori definitely didn't have. The waka would need to board the ships to do any real damage, and while they closed the gap and then climbed the sides, Tasman's cannons and muskets would have the opportunity to get at least a few good shots at them. The other problem that Tasman faced was that he had been explicitly instructed to avoid conflict with any people he came across. The VOC didn't want to sour themselves on any future trade partners, especially considering that Tasman already had a bit of a reputation for being very harsh on indigenous populations in the past. Overall, it was very much in the interest of the Dutch to keep the peace. But for Tūmatakōkiri, they would likely be better served by making a preemptive strike. Though the two sides didn't explicitly know what their best course of action was. Remember, a lot of this tactical information was concealed to both groups. We, in the 21st century, have the benefit of hindsight, and thus it's easy for us to say what was a good or bad idea. For those on the ground at the time, working with limited information, it isn't that straightforward. Whatever Tasman's personal thoughts on how to proceed, his council thought that the Māori were, quote-unquote, seeking friendship. Even so, the tension between both sides must have been palpable. As the sun rose and the people on land and sea woke to a new day, discussions may have resumed, particularly in the pā. On the morning of the 19th of December, 2 waka of 13 men each came out to investigate the Dutch ships, one of them getting within range of the Dutch cannons. The ship's journal opens its description of the encounter by talking about the features and appearance of the Māori, how their skin colour was, quote, between brown and yellow, end quote, and that they were, quote, rough in voice, end quote. Things like that. The Dutch waved at the Māori, attempting to invite them on board, holding up white cloth and metal knives to show they had goods to trade. The Māori called back in kind, but, as before, neither side knew what the other was saying, and so the waka returned back to shore. What this was about isn't certain, but it is highly likely that they were getting one last assessment of the ships to finalise whatever plan they had come up with the night before. Later that day, Tasman summoned his council to seek a consensus on how they should proceed. They once again agreed that these people, quote, apparently sought our friendship, end quote, and that they should move some of their ships closer to the beach, into some of the deep water that the scouting party had found the day before. Their intention was still very much to talk with these people, and then gain their trust to find out what valuables they had to trade. While the council were deliberating within the Heimskirk, the beach was a flurry of activity. About 100 toa from the pa had amassed on the beach, launching 9 waka into the water and immediately making a beeline for the Dutch ships. Of the 9 waka that bore down on them, 7 held back, while 2 were sent forward to likely scout out weak points and initiate the plan. 1 went in front of the Zeihan and another behind it, a much larger waka, possibly the lead vessel. The 2 waka called out to each other on occasion, and again, unsure of what was being said, the Dutch tried the trade tactic once more, showing the linen and other goods they carried. But the men aboard the waka didn't seem to care. It was at this point that the skipper of the Zeihan sent his quartermaster and 6 others in the cockboat back to his ship. All of the council were still on board the Heimskirk, so any orders would require an officer to jump in a boat and cross the water. He wanted to let his second mates know to be on their guard if the Māori decided to take up the trading offer, and not to let too many of them on board. The men climbed into the small boat and began to row their way between the 2 motherships. When the cockboat was about halfway to the Zeihan, the men on the smaller waka close to the prow began to call out to the one at the stern. They had seen the cockboat, waving their paddles and yelling to get the attention of the lead vessel. This must not have worked, because the waka that was making all this noise decided to just fucking gun it to the boat, going so fast that the rowboat lurched violently in the water when they collided. Game on. As the waka rammed the cockboat, a toa at the front stabbed the quartermaster in the neck several times with what might have been a taiaha, wounding him and sending him overboard. From there, the toa surged onto the boat, wielding wooden patu and paddle. A small battle ensued where 3 more Dutch were killed and 1 was mortally wounded. Those that survived, the quartermaster and 2 others, swam back to the Heimskirk, Tasman sending a small sloop to pick them up. As they did, the toa reboarded their waka, taking one of the bodies of the Europeans and tossing another in the water before setting the cockboat adrift. It was at this point that Tasman ordered his men to fire their muskets at the waka. Though they didn't hit anyone, it succeeded in getting the Māori to back off and return to shore. When they were out of musket range, Tasman ordered his bow and upper deck cannons to fire some shots at them, but again, they didn't hit their targets. Having potentially scared 2 of them off, for the moment, things seemed to calm down. All 9 vessels backed off after the skirmish, so a man was sent to retrieve the cockboat, in which he found the body of one of the men killed and the man who was mortally wounded. Once that was secure, it became pretty clear to Tasman that they weren't going to be able to come to an understanding with these people. Or perhaps just as likely, now that some of his men were dead, he had no interest in even continuing to try. He wrote in his journal, quote, "We could not hope to enter into nay friendly relations with these people, or be able to get water or refreshments here," end quote. As such, they weighed anchor and set sail immediately. Upon the return of the Wakatoa with their prize, that of a slain enemy, the rangatira must have realised that even if these newcomers were spirits, they bleed just like they do. And if there was ever one universal rule, it is that if it bleeds, it can be killed. As the Dutch made their escape, Tasman saw 11 waka being launched from the beach, who immediately gunned it, rapidly closing the gap. Tasman described each vessel as, quote, swarming with people, end quote. If 2 matakokiri couldn't make a decisive blow here, they would at least try to scare the shit out of them into never returning. As the waka drew within firing range, the Dutch cannons roared once again, possibly not trying to sink the waka, but just to deter them, by making their shots as close to the waka as possible without hitting them. The Zeihan, however, did manage to hit someone, likely a rangatira, and potentially kill them. At this, the toa erupted in loud shouts directed towards the Dutch, possibly a haka. However, they must have realised that the ships were heading for open water, because the waka fell back to regroup with the rest of the toa, at least one waka using its sail to do so. As for the man that died, well, Tasman isn't actually sure whether he was killed, because the journal says he, quote, fell down, end quote. But if the cannonball did hit him, then chances are he didn't survive that. By mid-afternoon, the Dutch were out of the bay and over the horizon, heading east. The actions of the Māori were described as quote-unquote detestable deeds by Tasman, and he added that they should, quote, consider the inhabitants of this country as enemies, end quote. Due to the events of the last couple of days, Tasman hadn't found the time to give a proper European name to Mohua. But now that they were away from the danger, he was able to pen the perfect one. Murderer's Bay. It didn't really stick though, since the English name nowadays is Golden Bay. He also named the route he was taking up the west coast the Abel Tasman Passage, which also hasn't seen much use. As a side note, this interaction is also significant because it is the first time that Māori are depicted in art by someone that wasn't Māori. Gilliesmans made some drawings showing what the Māori looked like, along with their clothes and waka, though he doesn't include moko on their faces or bodies, potentially because he didn't get a close enough look to see it. There is also no mention of moko or other tattoos in any of the journals, which is usually something that comes up when Europeans write about Māori. So I think it's safe to assume no one else got a good look either. If you want to see what that picture is, you can go to the website historyofaotearoa.com and it will be the cover photo for this episode. Before we finish this very exciting episode, there is one more thought I want to leave you with. When the waka crashed into the cockboat, I said that 4 of them died. One of the bodies was found in the boat, another was still alive but he died later of his wounds, one was tossed into the water, either already dead or left to drown since sailors often didn't know how to swim, and another was dragged on board the waka to be taken back to the beach. Both the state and Haida-Kopa copies say that 4 people died in this attack, but the sailor's copy says only 3. Now, this could just be a simple mistake. Maybe the writer of the sailor's copy just didn't count the bodies correctly in the chaos of the moment. One of them was taken away, so that's all that would have been left. That's very plausible. But, if we put on our tinfoil hats for a second, could it be something else? Is it possible that the man taken onto the waka was alive? Perhaps even still conscious, calling out to his comrades to save him as they fired upon Tasman's order. If so, it would make sense that the ship's journal of the expedition says 4 sailors died instead of 3, since Tasman sailing away from Mohua Golden Bay was effectively condemning that man to death, at least in terms of the official record. Or there is the possibility that Tasman wanted to cover up the fact that he left one man behind with an unknown fate. Not exactly a great look to his bosses. However, even if the man was still alive, he likely would have been swiftly executed upon getting to Taupo Pa. It's all speculation, and almost certainly the real truth is that the sailor's copy simply miscounted, just like he got the dates wrong. But that slight discrepancy is just enough that it could mean something more. maybe he lived out the rest of his days as a Mokai, slave, the only white man among brown faces at the edge of the world. Next time, we will see what happened to Tasman after this incident, following him for the rest of his time in Aotearoa, as well as what he gets up to elsewhere in the Pacific. If you want to get in touch, my email and social media are on historyaotearoa.com. Aotearoa spelt Aotearoa. You can also find helpful resources there, like transcripts and sources. If you'd like to support Hans, you can do so through donating via Patreon or giving us a review. As always, haere tu atu, hoki tu mai. See you next time.